Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this incredibly special Women Writing Women event. I'm Kate Mosse, and I have the great honour of being the person who does the interviews for CFT, pre and post show. Sadly, of course, this season has not happened, but we have decided to make sure that some of the highlights of the events around it could still take place. So tonight should have been the press night for Andrea Levy's The Long Song, a new adaptation by Suhayla El-Bushra and directed by Charlotte Gwynner. And we had got together an extraordinary panel of people to talk to you about this. And then we thought, why not? We don't need the play. I mean, we do need the play. We'll get the play again, later, hopefully next year. But we thought we'd celebrate, and it's good that it's not press night because it's really windy and cold in Chichester tonight. And normally we have sunlit uplands for new plays in CFT. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Andrea Levy and her work and her adaptation. Andrea died last year, in February last year, and she was a multi-award winning novelist, as everybody will know, although she actually started her working life as a part-time costume assistant for the BBC and the Royal Opera House. So that all fits very nicely together. And she's the author of 5 novels and a book of stories and essays. And of course, the one that I think made her a household name was Small Island, her 4th novel, which won the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is nice for me because I was involved in setting that up, the Whitbread Book of the Year and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And it was made into a 2-part BBC series and then a national theatre production adaptation by Helen Edmondson, which was in 2019, which Andrea knew all about and was very involved with, even though she didn't really get to see what a complete success it was. And then her final novel was this one, The Long Song, which was longlisted for the Women's Prize and shortlisted for the Man Booker and won the Walter Scott. And there's already been a 3-part BBC series on this. And tonight here would have been the world premiere of the adaptation. And we're all keeping fingers crossed that we will see that this time next year. But what we're going to do is talk about Andrea. We're going to talk about gender and race in her writing. We're going to talk about the differences between novels and stage and plays. And to that end, we have a stellar panel all ready to join in with you. So introducing Arifa Akbar, who is The Guardian's chief theatre critic, a former literary editor of The Independent. She was head of content at Unbound Publishers and launch editor of the website Boundless. She's a trustee of the Orwell Foundation and has judged many prizes, including the Costa Biography Award, the UK Theatre Awards, and the Women's Prize for Fiction. So lovely to see you, Arifa. Sara Collins studied law at the LSE and worked as a lawyer for 17 years before obtaining a master's degree in creative writing from Cambridge, where she was the 2015 recipient of the Michael Holroyd Prize, which actually I remember him telling me about because he was so blown away. Yeah, he did. It was like, whoa, you should read this. And then 2019, her first novel, I mean, it's obviously sickening, ladies and gentlemen, her first novel won the Costa First Novel Award for The Confessions of Franny Langton. And it's a wonderful Gothic romance about a love affair between a Jamaican maid and her French mistress in 19th century London. And I don't think it's unfair to say that it's one of the books that has helped change how people see who can write what. It's a really significant book, and it's a fabulous read if you haven't yet read it. And last but by no means least, we have theatre royalty with us tonight, which is Ade Solanke debut play, Pandora's Box, was nominated for Best New Play in the Offies, the Off West End Awards. It was shortlisted for the Nigerian Prize for Literature and won Best Play in the Afro Hollywood Awards. So this is also sickening, obviously, because I have only written my first play and I'm nearly 60. So what can I say? Her play, East End Boys, West End Girls, won a BEFFTA Award for Best Play in 2015. And she's a senior lecturer in creative writing at the University of Greenwich, has an MFA in screenwriting from the University of Southern California, and was a Fulbright scholar there, and worked as a story analyst in Hollywood. So, ladies and gents, you can't say we're shortchanging you with this panel. So what we're going to do, I've just asked everybody to talk a little bit about their thoughts about Andrea Levy, her work and her significance, and then we're going to broaden it out to writing in general. So, Arifa, do you want to take it away? I'm doing alphabetical order here, you can see.
I hope everyone can hear me, and I hope this volume is okay. But Kate, please tell me if I'm too quiet. So Andrea Levy, you know, like so many people, I discovered Small Island, Andrea Levy and Small Island through my book group, you know, around the time it was published. I went on to the Long Song, and they were meaningful then. And they were beautifully told stories, and they were very serious stories, but they had that element of farce. So there was comedy, and then it cut away and it gave you something very hard, and then it was comedy again. And I loved the way she told her stories with that mix of the serious and the farcical, the Jamaican farcical stuff. They meant something to me then when they were published. But I think, and I'll sort of paraphrase you, Kate, because an introduction to Wuthering Heights, an anthology on Wuthering Heights, which is a book and an author that you love, you know, Emily Bronte, you've said that that book changes as you change. And I really believe that books change as you change, you know, and you read them differently, you receive them differently. And I think I encountered Small Island again in the stage form just this summer, you know, in our lockdown, when we've had National Theatre Live giving us their archive or their live footage. And I saw Small Island when so much has gone off in the past few years that has made that's changed Small Island for me, namely the Windrush scandal. And suddenly I was receiving Small Island in a different way, incredibly powerful, impactful, but different. And the Long Song now, I think, for me, I receive it differently because of George Floyd, because of Black Lives Matter, because of the discussion we're having around statues, the discussion we're having around history and slavery. So for me, she's an extraordinary storyteller, but the rest of it is about me and the world. I think her stories have come to regain a significance, and a shocking significance for me this summer or in the last couple of years. Yeah. So in short, I'll stop there. There's more I can say, but I'm going to stop there.
No, well, that's fantastic. And I can see everybody nodding. And to all of you listening at home, just to say, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions, type them into the box. And then the theatre will send them all through, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So, you know, don't hold back. Sara, I could see you nodding
yes.
through what Arifa was saying. So can you remember reading Small Island or the Long Song?
Indelibly. It's not an overstatement to say that two novelists opened the doors for publication of a novel like mine. Zadie Smith was the first, and Andrea Levy was the second, and only because that's how their books appeared in chronological order. There's something that I've said on the road often when I've been invited to speak, which is that in the literary world, as in the rest of the world, power seems to be measured in adjectives. And the more adjectives you have, the further away you are from the center of things. So for me personally, those adjectives are Caribbean, Black, female, pushing you further and further into the margins. And writers like those two, and I put them in the pantheon with Toni Morrison, the thing they did that was so profoundly impactful for me was they reclaimed those adjectives. You know, they made them badges of honor rather than markers of segregation. Black British female writers telling Black British female stories and being taken seriously for doing so. But beyond what it meant for me professionally, there was the personal angle. You know, I suppose even closer than Arifa, I am Jamaican, of Jamaican descent. I grew up in England, you know, went to boarding school in Sussex. I felt a profound love for both places, but there felt like an unbridgeable gap between them in spite of this old colonial relationship. And Small Island kind of sort of smacked me in the teeth. You know, it was this, not just because Levy had told Jamaican stories, because there were many wonderful novelists who had told Jamaican stories before, but only Jamaican people seemed to pay attention to them. Here was Levy, everyone was talking about her. As Arifa says, it was the book club book. It was a huge, well-reviewed, it was a prize winner. She was putting a kind of writing on the map, which paid attention to stories like my grandmother's and my mother's. and made them seem like lives that were worthy of attention and respect. And that's the power of storytelling. I think the Times Literary Supplement said that she provided a corrective to the historical record. And for me, that connected in a way that was electric. I'm sure, I've said this about Toni Morrison, but I think it applies also to Andrea Levy, that I would not have written a novel and certainly wouldn't have had a novel published had it not been for her example.
Yeah. And she would be so thrilled to hear that, you know, I mean, because she was an incredibly generous writer. So when she was longlisted for the inaugural Women's Prize for Fiction in 1996, she came to judge it in 1997 in order to absolutely help other voices to come through. And of course, obviously, then won it. Ade, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. It's lovely to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I've just got some general thoughts, which we'll probably come back to as we discuss the impact of her work on our work as writers. Just to say, sadly, I didn't know Andrea, the person. I've known lots of people who've known her. And at her funeral in March last year, it was actually the same day as we did a launch of, as you know, Margaret Busby's amazing groundbreaking Daughters of Africa. Margaret came to the launch at, the Women of the World Festival from the funeral. So it was a sober affair. We were celebrating this anthology, which is a showcase and a celebration of African women writers. And then we'd lost, and you know, that day was her burial, one of our leading writers. So as Andrea was laid to rest, we were birthing a book that her work was not only part of course she's included in the work, but it's a book representing a culture of literary production, as Sara has just said, amongst Black women, that she, more than, and as much as anyone, helped usher in that culture of us, as Sara says, having been able to tell our stories. So it was bittersweet to launch the book with her not with us. She's inspired countless writers, myself included. I think her writing cemented the impact of writing by Black women in society. Last year, I actually organised a tribute to her at the Greenwich Book Festival. And you know, her name was there, it was packed out. And so many people said they'd come because of the Windrush scandal and the way in which her book had brought to them and given them insights into that whole world. So I think the book remains, and may be so for many years, the go-to rendition of, if you like, the agony and the ecstasy of that generation of Caribbean migrants and their historical migration to Britain. But I also admire her work, and I'm sure we'll speak more about this, because of her skills as a literary artist. And some of the prose qualities I particularly enjoy are her liveliness, I think, her wit and her humour. She sees the funny side of tragedy, as Arifa mentioned, and her take on slavery isn't dirge-like and dreary, as horrendous as that institution was. But it's alive, her long song is alive with the agency of free-thinking and proactive, shrewd people. As much as their bodies are enslaved, their minds are free. The other thing I admire is her prose style. I'm a former journalist, and as a script writer, we're not encouraged to wax lyrical. And there's something about the clarity and smoothness and simplicity, actually, of her sentences that appeal to me. It's my taste more than anything else, but I think that's also part of the appeal. And as I thought more about her work and read more about her, she, I think, started reading novels in her 20s and had been watching TV for many years before.
Didn't really read,
So then her style has been influenced by televisual storytelling, visual writing, basically. So I admire Andrea, the dramatist, and I know I'm looking forward to the show at Chichester next year. I think her plots and her characters are particularly successfully adapted because she's already got that visual quality. They work well on screen or on stage, I'm sure they will, because she's already captured, I think, the essential ingredient of dramatic writing, which is the poetry of action. Her characters are always moving, and of course mental movement is the key to, you know, prose, the dramatized consciousness, etc., what characters are thinking, and she does that naturally, expertly. But you know, drama means to do, and what she has her characters do are interesting things, and she designs the structure of the story as much as she designs their mental landscapes. And I think that physical movement gives her work that the vitality and liveliness that makes it work so well on stage. I think she's also quite rightly celebrated as a historian, a chronicler of the Windrush generation, and also my generation. I'm a few years younger than her. And I grew up in London too, but in a different part of London. And I had a totally different experience. So as I'm now writing my first novel about growing up in Notting Hill, I'm so informed by her story of her childhood, and in particular, the way her parents felt about their heritage. Because I'm Nigerian British, British Nigerian, my experience was completely different. You know, Nigerians are not known for being shy, put it like that. And so the kind of
successful novelists, Nigerian.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of very good writing.
Absolutely. What I'm saying in terms of the British Nigerian story, she was very candid about the way her parents weren't keen at first, I think, to celebrate their heritage. But our experience was the opposite. I think she has, through her stories, given me a wider picture of Black British life, of my generation, because I was around in Ladbroke Grove, lots of Caribbean culture, but it was very much what we called a rebel culture. And we were into Bob Marley, we were all growing locks. I wasn't, but lots of my friends were. So she's given me a more complete picture of the range of Black experience of my generation.
And well, I mean, that's fantastic sort of analysis of everything that Andrea can mean to different areas of London. But in a way, I mean, everything that you've all said is about Andrea Levy was British, and she was writing that part of the story, and her story is as British as my story is, or Arifa's is, or yours is, Ade, or yours, well, you have over the water stuff as well. But I mean, I think this is a very important point. So I just wonder if you all like to reflect upon that a bit. The idea about who has the right to tell what story, and how each of you in your own, either reviewing Arifa, you write a lot as well, of course, and you bring your critical eye to many different forms, you know, fiction, now theatre, of course, but both you, Ade and Sara, that sense of are you allowed to be just an artist? That's the thing. Can you be, as a Black British writer, a woman of colour, can you be just an artist, or are you always channeled into a particular type of narrative?
Well, should I go?
Yeah, you go, then Sara can go. It's very weird. I don't actually know where anybody's sitting. I'm pointing randomly, obviously. I'm probably just pointing at my ceiling, but you know, never mind. You go. You're on my left.
Well, I think you can, any artist can make choices about what they do. The question is really, what's the response, and how well will you be embraced if you don't conform to certain notions of what you should be writing? So my stance has always been, I think my story in all aspects is of interest, and I will explore it. And actually, almost regardless of what, if you like, the industry says is permissible or should be my terrain or my turf, there's obviously consequences for that. You know, it's easier if you maybe write work which corresponds or conforms to a certain notion of what you should be writing. So that for me, the answer is twofold. The answer is yes, there are still, I think, ways in which we are curtailed. But as an artist, you can make a choice about whether or not that will dictate what you choose to focus on. I've always said Black women will be my protagonists, not because I don't think other people have interesting stories, but I think there've been one or two about white men. I think there've been a little bit more about white women. So if I don't do it, who will?
Yeah, and it's the unheard and the underheard stories, and they're not the same, but yeah, very important. Sara.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think it's important, because I'm fortunate enough to have this platform, to use it to put women center stage in narratives where they haven't been seen before. I've said quite often in describing my novel that one of my motivations was to make sure that a Black woman was center stage in a Gothic romance, because it seemed absolutely ludicrous to me that that hadn't been done many, many times before. But then there is also this burden which comes with it. And I think it goes back to Ade's point about expectations. The expectation, because you're a Black woman writer, is that you will be put into a box of always speaking about serious things, always producing literary serious works that always tackle racism. And in talking about the work, you're expected to interrogate Blackness rather than craft. You know, it's a problem that's afflicted everyone all Black women who have ever written. And Toni Morrison said something about it, which I have in my notebook, which I have with me. She said, "I have a yearning for a certain environment in which I can speak and write without every sentence I form being understood as mere protest or advocacy." And I think the next wave for Black female British writing is going to be reclaiming that space, is going to be asserting the universality of our concerns. And I think the problem is that the publishing industry assumes an ideal reader, and assumes that ideal reader will only be interested in stories that depart from a certain norm, the default being white and possibly male, as matters of special interest. And I think what we need to do is get to a point where these stories are not seen as special interest stories or advocacy or protest, but simply stories, and we're not there yet. And until we are, we're still going to be seen as Black British writers as contributing something to the discussion on race, but not necessarily the discussion on craft.
Yes, and I think it's one of the reasons for setting up the Women's Prize 25 years ago was precisely this, the idea that there was this mythology of a neutral, literary, creative voice, which when you decode it is a white male voice, and usually bearded in those days. Sure, I mean, I love that, don't get me wrong. But it was, and that everything else around that was niche. So the idea that women only wanted to read women, people of colour or Black women only wanted to read Black women, but somehow everybody else, there was a universal experience. And blowing that open is what we're all about, isn't it? Arifa, you've done so much, both, reviewing as a journalist and as a publisher. So presumably what Ade and Sara are saying is chiming very strongly with you.
So that chimes very strongly indeed. So as far as, so I want to look at this in the theatre world actually, but just to, I mean, what you both said is I think in a nutshell is that there's the expectation, but there's also a sort of, one can't escape one's identity. A white man can't escape that identity and will be writing in some way from that point of view. And I will be writing as a British, South Asian, Pakistani, and I will infuse some of my writing. I don't do creative writing, but I will infuse my writing, my columns in The Guardian, my criticism. I will bring elements of that part of my heritage to, that insight, as well as the British side, as well as all the other sides. So I can't escape the politics of my own identity, and neither would I pretend to or want to. And I don't think any of us can. I think the publishing world still has this intransigent problem of, and I think it's a lack of faith in allowing writers of colour to write stories as opposed to write about identity. And it's the most basic of errors, because they seem to think, well, if you're a writer of colour, you've got to somehow explain or explain yourself, and heritage has got to be part of your narrative, because otherwise people won't know where to place you, and there's a real anxiety around there. What I'm seeing in the publishing world, I hope it continues, and in the theatre as well, is that I'll take a book that was on the Women's Prize last year, which was a fantastic satire farce called My Sister, the Serial Killer. And it was, who's it by again? I've forgotten the name.
Braithwaite, yeah.
What's her first? So anyway, it's by a, she Nigerian.
Yeah.
Nigerian-born, young Nigerian-born.
You've got it on the shelf somewhere, actually.
It's a macabre sort of. It's a story of a murder. It's got a very farcical tone. It's got identity and violence and cultural identity and race. It's there, but what's really there is story and form and wit and tone. And what I'm seeing in the theatre, which I think is quite exciting, are young, particularly young Black British playwrights playing with form. So their plays are about race, but it's not a sort of chronological, real story of here's my heritage story. Here's a story about, you know, racial violence or oppression. There's a play with form, there's originality. I can think of Jasmine Lee Jones at the Royal Court, who gave us last year a really unusual play that brought internet sort of culture, Twitter culture, together with a witty satirical narrative, together with the issue of racial bullying and violence online. And it was very unusually told. Social media was read out. We have an American playwright, Antoinette Nwandu. I don't know if anybody encountered Passover at the Kiln Theatre. It's about racial violence, but it's splicing, American white on black police violence with Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and it's doing something really clever with form there, with sort of literary or stage form, and it's those ways which I find, it's those stories that I think are finding freedom and attempting to get away from this albatross of, because you're from this heritage, we need a story that reflects your identity in the most obvious and
Ade, yeah. Do you want to come in, Ade? Because obviously you've been very successful in this area.
I completely agree, but I would also mention that term, which I heard a lot when I started out as a writer, the burden of representation. For many years, I didn't quite get what people meant, because it didn't feel like a burden to me. Now, I do understand there are lots of writers who feel that it is a burden to have to tell their heritage story. That isn't necessarily the case, because there are people who are interested in doing that, and there are audiences who are interested in that. I think the issue is the extent to which, as Sara was saying, you can choose what your material will be. And I agree with Arifa that those plays she's mentioned do really take us in new directions. But I don't want us to think, or I'm not certainly in agreement with the idea that heritage stories in and of themselves are a problem, because I'm still interested in exploring, for example, the British Nigerian cultural experience. We haven't really had that. Butchie did a brilliant job 30 odd years ago, but in terms of, if you like, my generation, we haven't really had that many. We've had a few really interesting ones.
And also, I think,
I'm not against that. Sorry.
I was just going to echo that and say, most of the wonderful canonical novels are heritage stories as well. I think the problem is that we have been taught to devalue our heritage, and so we still see it as something sidelined. The great Nigerian novels are in the tradition of the great Russian novels, are in the tradition of the great Caribbean novels, etc., etc. Heritage is not necessarily a bad thing. But the way we look at heritage reflects the way we've been taught to see the world. And I remember reading a story about Andrea Levy, when she, the fact that her parents were trying to sort of stifle their Jamaican identity when they came here. They wanted her to be properly British. They didn't give her access to those stories. She sort of had to beg her mother for the stories in order to write Small Island. It was a kind of sense of sort of imbued shame, if you like, even being on a racial awareness course at work and having to pick whether she joined the white group or the black group, and instinctively joining the white group until the black group called her over. And then I think Small Island, which was her breakout novel, was a heritage novel. So I couldn't agree more with Ade that there is privilege and joy and success in tapping into your heritage. But as with everything else, it translates to power. It translates to who is seen as having the power and who's seen as having the voices that are worthwhile and the heritage that's worthwhile.
And also, as a historical novelist, I would say this, wouldn't I? But everything that we're all saying is about, the truth is that there has always been a partial view of history in which, as Adrienne Rich, the great American poet, would say, in which our voices do not appear. Yes. And that's all women's voices, and it's exaggerated for Black women, women of color, disabled, the further you go, exactly as you said, Sara. So one of the things about the long song, and just the idea of the stage, and this has come up from a couple of things that you've all been saying, is the power, perhaps, and I'd like to know what you all feel about this, the power of a piece of theatre to tell a history, to introduce to an audience history and a story that they didn't even know they didn't know. And for me, in a way, I'm a novelist, or I'm a baby playwright. I should have had a play on opening a couple of weeks at Chichester, which next year we'll all be there. And that's my heritage story, growing up in Fishbourne. It's not quite the same. But it's, you know, the idea that often people are very shuttered about what they want to hear. But when you go to the theatre and the lights go down, and then suddenly you're faced with beautiful language and beautiful writing and incredible performances and light and colour and movement, everything that you do, Ade, and I'm attempting to do. And
sure, you're doing very well.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of taxidermy, so it's maybe not so beautiful, but, you know, hey-ho, can't have everything. But it's, I'm very interested in what you all feel about that, the power of the stage to, if you like, get under the skin and tell the history that people might otherwise not engage with.
I can say...
Great question. I've silenced my panel. Fantastic.
I was just allowing the theatre experts to go first before I weigh in with my inexperienced opinion.
I mean, my first thing would be, yes, that shared experience is something I can't wait to re-experience. You know, the breathing in and out with other strangers in a shared space, in, you know, paying attention to the same characters, story, the language, and experiencing all of that together it's one of the great pleasures of, well, I'm a theatre maker, so obviously it's one of the great pleasures of my life. And I agree, yes, there is something unique in that the access, that story delivery system, the theatrical one, gives the spectator in that instance to experience, to the if you like, otherness that often shrouds our engagement and encounter with each other. When I read about you know, Jamaica in the 1800s on the page, that's there's an intimacy in that engagement. But when I see that the character of July embodied, as I will in the production next year, there will be a different level of intimacy, because this is a flesh and blood person in front of me. So I think there is something extraordinary in the theatrical experience that, as much as I love writing for the stage and the screen, that live shared experience is unique, and I think it is uniquely able to bring us together. I agree with your point.
I think,
Arifa.
yeah, no, I think we're seeing, I think I'm, the revisionism, historical revisionism is what I think you're sort of talking about, Kate. I mean, I've seen recently some shows that tweak history. To Hamilton is a show that takes history and takes a figure in American history who's fairly well known and written about and talked about, a Caribbean-born actually statesman, and by doing stuff with, you know, turning song into rap on a major stage, by casting people of colour to play George Washington and the rest. It's doing something with history. It's urging audiences to ask questions of how they normally receive historical fiction or historical drama on a stage. Why was Hamilton considered so revolutionary? It was telling a story, a well-known story of, in America, a fairly well-known statesman. But Miranda did something pretty radical, and it's actually slightly depressing to realize that the historical revisionism lay in the way he casted, in the way those songs were sung, to make us realize, just to see history differently. I saw an amazing play, I've forgotten the name of it, and it's annoying, by a female playwright, about Black maids in the time of Queen Victoria. What was it again? It was up in it was in Leicester or somewhere, wasn't it? And it was a really
I can see it, yeah.
Yeah, and it, again, we know about Victorian England and maids, and actually David Olusoga has told us and reminded us that that historically these people were there but invisible in plain sight now, but they were there. But this play did interesting things by giving us the story of the Black Maid. And I can think of plays popping up like that are doing history, but from the point of view of the Black Maid. There was a fantastic play on earlier this year called The Whip, which again looked at Britain's part in, after the end of abolition of slavery, how it was ended, how slavers were given compensation, for their loss of slaves, and that play dealt with that, and that's a history that again I think should be known to all of us, that compensation, and it's not known. And so these plays are, I think, the plays that look at history differently. It needn't be here's a new piece of history. It's just this is the history of this period that we say we know really well, but actually we don't know, because there was a whole other invisible history here. The other thing is, I was just talking today to an actor, Roshenda Sandel. If any of you know her, she's a brilliant actor. She's actually acting in Alan Bennett. The Bridge Theatre is putting on a load of Alan Bennett monologues, and she's doing one of them. She's mixed race, a British mixed race actor. She's in Steve McQueen's drama. There's a 5-part drama on 1980s activism in Britain. It takes us to 20 years actually, and it's around the Mangrove 9, if any of us know who those are.
That was in my area. Mangrove was in Ladbroke.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's Ladbroke Grove, wasn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. And here is Steve McQueen, who's written and directed this series, telling, Addie, this history, and we know it, we know about this history, but there's a whole load of people that don't, and there's an argument that we should all know, because it is part of British history, but some of us don't know it, and here is Steve McQueen saying, here's British history.
It's my lovely dad, when I was writing historical fiction, and I was trying to explain about the Women's Prize and all of these things, and he's gone now, but he said, so I see, it's not about leaving people out, it's about getting a bigger table and bringing up more chairs.
Yes.
Right.
And that's it,
It's colouring in.
Yeah, Sara, did you want to?
Yes, I'm going to say something controversial now. I'll end by saying something controversial. I do want to make the point that, of course, novels are also reinterrogating the past.
Indeed.
And that's what attracted me to historical fiction. In my own novel, I take a good, long, hard look at the abolitionists, one that they wouldn't have liked to take it themselves. But I completely agree with the idea that there is something about theatre that isn't reproduced in any of the other mediums. And part of it is, take Hamilton, for example, a book simply cannot break out into a bit of hip hop. And that's very engaging, it's very immediate. I've seen Hamilton 4 times. There is something about being in a room with other people, experiencing in real time a piece of art that makes you feel like you're there. That it reproduces the conversation between reader and writer in a novel, and between viewer and screen for TV, but it takes out this sort of cold intermediary. Everyone is participating in the creation of the art in real time. My controversial statement is, and I'm not the expert on this, but how accessible is theatre? When we talk about opening people's eyes to history, I think about how much it costs to go and see Hamilton.
Oh, it's true.
How accessible
you're right.
is
Musicals,
theatre, and whose eyes are being opened? Some of the most inventive bits of theatre, like Hamilton, I fear, are not accessible to the people who could benefit from seeing them, which is why a lot of people were celebrating the fact that it had been made available on screen by Disney recently, even though seeing a bit of theatre on screen is like, I don't know, trying to drink water through a washcloth. It's not the same thing.
It's such a issue.
But there is a huge question about accessibility, and even not just in terms of price, because I will also say that there are people from certain demographics who still see theatre as a very white, middle or upper class pursuit. It's something that is quote unquote not for us. And just like we've pointed out the issue with the publishing industry and who is seen as the ideal reader, I do think the theatre industry needs to do more looking inward about who is seen as the ideal viewer and consumer of these innovative productions.
Yeah, I mean, I know Ade will have lots to say on that. I think, I mean, this is a huge and other subject, and maybe we should all come back to talk about it. The thing that I think is really significant in a theatre like Chichester, which obviously is a very particular demographic in Sussex, is, for example, this season that has not happened, and obviously they're trying to reschedule some of the things. Not everything will happen. It's a complicated thing. But many, you know, there are huge attempts being made by lots and lots of theatres, not just on price, but in terms of accessibility, in terms of the way things are presented, these sorts of things that are on, the demographic in terms of age in particular, and bringing that down. And I was very struck, you know, I should have had a play on this year, and I felt very proud to be in a season where 7 of the 12 directors were women, and 6 of the 12 writers were women. And of the directors, 4 of 7 of the directors were Black women or women of colour. And I think those things make almost the biggest difference, that if you invite other people into your spaces to make the work, and Ade knows all about this because I've, you know, looking at some of the things that you've done and where you've taken some of your productions in order to reach new audiences, that's what makes the difference. It not being just one.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think every theatre has its audience development team, and widening participation is, you know, on the agenda. The only issue I would say, or I would make, is that of course it's important to have women directors, Black women directors, Black male directors, etc., and writers, but it's also about the kind of work that they produce. Just because you have a, you know, my work, for example, I'm a Black woman writer, but I also do decide, I deliberately, as, you know, when I write, for example, Nigerian plays, I'm writing with that Nigerian audience in mind, and everyone's invited. But some theatres may think that will exclude what they might consider possibly their core audience. So there's an issue there about the kind of work. Just because you have Black writers and directors, that in and of itself doesn't always bring in Black audiences.
No, that's right. Yeah, yeah. And of course but it's also, I think, what you've all been saying in different ways, and it's wonderful to hear so many different examples. You're all being very generous about other work as well, is that once we get away from the idea of there isn't a neutral voice, that everything could potentially appeal to everybody or leave other people out, it's okay. You know, if actually the entire audience for Small Island is a Black audience, then great. Why shouldn't it be? You know, it's about across the course of the season. So, I mean, obviously, I know that there will be, you know, I know everybody will be hoping that the long song could be on next year. But I think that what you do, Ade, and what you have done, Sara, in books, and Arifa, you know, the way that you review and the wide range of things, I'm sure that everybody at Chichester will want to see you all down, seeing all of this work, because the wider the range of makers, the wider the range of audience. And I think that's right. Now, we've got some questions coming through. We've got quite a few, so I'm going to whip through because you've been so fascinating that I have, you know, horribly mismanaged the time. So here is one from Anna Mazzola. Sorry, Anna, if I've said your name wrong, who says, thanks for a fantastic discussion. You mentioned Hamilton, which she loved, and presented historical drama in a really exciting way, but I wasn't sure about its female characters. What do you think? Does anybody want to do
I think Anna's a novelist, if I've got the right Anna Mazzola. So if it is, then hello, Anna. I think she's a very
is that Anna?
Novelist.
Well,
I think so. I think
speak to me later.
Yeah. Yes, you know, there's a question mark about Hamilton, and actually, if we consider it in the context of historical revisionism, it raises all kinds of questions about how useful that is. I think Hamilton has to be seen as a bit of storytelling, not as a bit of record correcting. Miranda himself has had to engage with debate about the treatment of Sally Hemings, for example, who becomes a kind of glib footnote, you know, sort of a joke, a punchline, completely devaluing her experience. But I think the problem is we cannot look to certain kinds of theatre experience as filling in the gaps. And we only look to plays like Hamilton to teach us history, because the history we are taught is inadequate, woefully inadequate. we shouldn't be learning about American history on stage. Really, we should be learning about American history accurately in school, so that we can then engage with Hamilton for what it is, which is a piece of art, which is accurate in some respects and deliberately less so in others. And that's really the problem.
And also, don't expect somebody to have to correct all the wrongs in one piece.
Yes.
Yeah. Another one, someone who hasn't left their name, says, we've all spoken movingly about Levy's influence and example. How conscious are you all, and I think particularly you, Ade and Sara, of being similar role models in your work?
Sara, do you want to go first?
Sneaky, very sneaky.
Yes, I mean, sort of conscious. To me, this whole experience is still so surreal. You know, I dreamed of having a novel published for so long and looked up to writers as absolute superheroes, you know, followed them obsessively the way my brothers followed football players. That to wake up having discovered myself transformed into one is like waking up having discovered myself transformed into Beyonce. So I have no concept of myself
I think
as
that's
a role
fair
model.
enough. Yeah.
But I will tell you, it feels wonderful to even take steps towards joining that tradition of, you know, the kinds of people who inspired me, and having the kind of reader response, you know, people saying, your book meant this to me. And by the way, not just from people like myself. My favorite reader response came from a white 96-year-old man who had spent his life as a sailor, you know, at sea, and said he passed the time reading while at sea, and so became a huge bookworm, and said my book was the second favorite he'd ever read.
Oh.
So, you know, that idea that you're connecting with people from all walks of life is just truly special. But I don't think role models are sort of conscious of going around, you know, I'm doing my role model thing now. I think your main aim is, can I do good work? Can I say something important? Can I be grateful for this platform I have and try to help open the door for other people?
Yeah. Ade?
I think Andrea's, the way in which she was particularly a role model for me was the openness and her candor as a writer. The way, for example, she wrote about shadism, colorism in the Caribbean was eye-opening for me. And I think that has encouraged me to be more frank, actually, about some of the taboos in you know, Nigerian or West African culture. And I hope that would encourage others to be equally open. You know, if we can't tell our truth in our own work, where can we? So I think that's as much as I would say. You know, if I'm going to inspire or influence other writers, I hope it's to be honest, which I think Andrea was brilliantly honest.
And to be bold.
Bold.
Because there you are doing
the right word. Yeah, that's the right word.
Bold. So this is for all of you, I think. Really interesting to hear what you think as well, Arifa, on this. How important, if at all, is it for the person adapting or directing a stage or screen adaptation of a novel by a writer of colour to be a person of similar heritage? It's such a thorny question, isn't it? Because it's about opportunities, and to whom do you give the opportunities?
Well, it's very relevant to Andrea Levy, this question, actually, I think, because of course the dramatization, the adaptation of Small Island was by Helen Edmondson and Rufus Norris. Now, I originally had I thought I'd have a problem with that. I didn't go and see it on stage, actually, and I got mixed reports. A lot of people I know thought it was an astonishing piece of work on theatre, an astonishing adaptation. Some of my British Caribbean friends felt they didn't like it at all, that the story had been funneled largely through Queenie, who is a white British character. The story had somehow become more hers than the other three characters. That's how some felt. Now, I didn't see it live on stage. I saw it on National Theatre Live, which is online. I totally disagree with you, Sara. I think online theatre has democratized in a way that
I did say that.
Yeah,
I didn't. No, we agree on that.
And as a form, online theatre has become its own thing. It's not it's actually its own thing, and a lot of writers of colour and dramatists of colour have created astonishing quick response work during lockdown. So I see online theatre as a complete game changer, but that's an aside. When I saw Small Island, I'll be honest, you know, on National Theatre Live, I was all ready to hate it because of its makers, quite frankly, and I couldn't hate it. I thought it was an astonishing piece of work. I also know, I spoke to the actor who played Hortense, Leah Harvey, who said that actually Andrea Levy wanted Helen Edmondson to write it. She wanted Rufus Norris to be part.
She was determined. She is the artist, decided who she wanted, and that was it.
And I have to say, you know, one of my most personal stories that I will always hold as a story that made me feel at home with my identity as a British South Asian person is My Beautiful Laundrette, written by Hanif Qureshi. Saw it when I was 14, and I finally identified myself with this Asian identity that he summed up so well through queerness. But that was directed by Stephen Frears, a middle-class, middle-aged white man. Now, that he did it well. There was insight there. There was collaboration, and I think with Small Island, there was collaboration with Andrea Levy's book. So yeah, I think if it can be done well, which in those two instances, I believe it was done well, great. I think not enough writers, dramatists of colour are given the jobs. I think there's a real problem there. So ideally, it would have been great if Small Island would have been written, directed.
But wouldn't it have been better if Macbeth was directed by a black director?
Yes.
Isn't
now
that
you're
the
talking.
thing? It's about the opportunity.
Now you're talking.
To be artists, and the idea that black directors and writers can only work in that area, whereas, you know, white people can direct or write whatever they want. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's about opportunity and making more, which is what I think CFT has done so well, to have more directors of colour and more women writers, because then, you know, it's just stories then, isn't it?
I did see Small Island live, and I was a bit cynical, I have to say, myself, and I came out completely dazzled and wowed. Yeah. But that's not the point. I agree with you, Kate. It's about opportunity. They did a fantastic job, there's no doubt. It was extraordinary. But how do you know a black director wouldn't have done an extraordinary job as well?
I still cannot believe that Steven Spielberg directed The Color Purple, and that was quite a long time ago. It blows my mind every time, as if I'm relearning the information. It's possible, but it comes back again to questions of power and opportunity. And when the power and the opportunity are skewed, then it's always, to me, going to feel like a shame if a seminal work like that, like Small Island or The Color Purple, isn't a sort of translated, you know, it doesn't have people of color involved in the production. You know, for example, for me, having my novel translated to screen, it's very important to me that the production is as diverse as it can be. That's not insignificant. Yeah. It's not just about how the subtleties of the work will be explored, but also who is being given the opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was given a brilliant piece of advice when I was setting up the Women's Prize, and I think you can extrapolate this out, is by Helena Kennedy, you know, the sort of most senior female law lord. Yeah. And she said to me, this is the best bit of advice. If you're asked to do something, Kate, and you can't do it, never put the phone down without recommending another woman.
Yes, yes.
And I think, you know, Ade, you do that, Sara, you do that, Arifa, it's that thing of bringing up more chairs to the table. So we don't all have to be the woman in the room, or the woman of colour in the room, or the black woman in the room. On that point, there's another really interesting question, and I don't know if you feel, you know, maybe Ade, I'd be very interested to hear what you feel on this. This is from Rose Evans, says, what does the panel think about the term that Rose, she really hates, colourblind casting, especially in the theatre? What do you think about that?
Well, two things. I've actually just written an article about why Black stories matter. That's a subject I've really been thinking about for the last few weeks. I relish any opportunity to see the extraordinary talent of actors. So when I see, you know, a Shakespearean play with a black lead actor, or, you know, whatever, that's a great thing to experience. It's, for me, it doesn't detract from the story. For me, it doesn't, we were talking about Hamilton, you know, Georgian revolutionary American history, cast with predominantly actors of colour, worked really well, gave us another lens, literally a lens, through which to view that experience. So I think it's a good thing. However, I do worry sometimes that as much as I'm happy to see that level of talent on stage, it also sometimes means we're not seeing, if you like, stories about, by and about Black life, by Black writers, about Black life, because those actors are being employed and we're grateful to see their work. So I just want us to have, or the actors to have the opportunity to play any role they want, but not at the expense of playing roles which are also exploring, examining what we've called earlier our heritage. And I just worry that sometimes that's what's happening.
Can I just add, just to build on that, recently I spoke to Winsome Pinnock, the playwright, and we spoke about colourblind casting, which she really despised the term. And she also despised the idea, the concept that, and this is how she explained it, and I hadn't thought of this, but she said the idea of, you know, colourblind casting, so casting, you know, even a Black Hamlet, she said for her didn't work because it was absolutely cutting the Black body, the historical Black body, off from its history. So, and she felt we weren't there. That wasn't right to do. The Black body comes to the stage, comes to any role with its history of violence, with its history of oppression, and she felt it wasn't right it didn't make sense.
I understand her point. I think, yeah. Sorry, Sarah, did you want to say something?
I think it was Arifa who was saying something.
Sorry.
It just made me reflect differently about colourblind casting, because I have to be honest, when I switched the telly on this Christmas and I saw, I think it was Scrooge, and there was
it was Nicholas Nickleby. Do you mean that adaptation?
David Copperfield as well.
David Copperfield as well.
Basically, classic stories where you see people of colour playing being there, being these gigantic canonical characters that we've known throughout, and I liked it, and I thought it was progress. And Winsome Pinnock's idea is something that I'm going to be thinking about now and really evaluating and trying to figure out what I think. I spoke to an actor of Amadeus, if anyone's seen Amadeus on stage, again at the National. And Masmati played Salieri, and he played Salieri so well. It's such an astonishing production. And I talked to him and I put this idea to him about the cutting of the Black body, and he understood it, but he absolutely disagreed with it. And I'm still toying with the idea of where you draw certain lines around these.
I think ideally we'd be doing, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ade.
I agree. I think we'd be doing both, but I think what's happening, what worries me is it seems to be at the expense of our stories. That's my impression. And I think, it's what I think the whole conversation has said, and I can't believe if we were in the real world, you see, I would have had to have stopped you talking 20 minutes ago, but because we are, online, we've been able to go on for a bit longer. But I think what you're all saying, which I'm sure everybody listening will feel is really important, is that we need more stories being told by the people who have got stories to tell, rather than just always doing the same old stories and mucking about with the casting, if you like. Though I love some of that as well. I think Masmati was incredible, and we've talked about a lot of things, but I also think it should be alongside new work. And it's Sara's work and Ade's work, and you should be free to write whatever you want. Andrea, we should finish on Andrea, once said to me, the difference between you and I, Kate, is that you can write whatever you want, and if I want to write a story about fairies at the end of the garden, they'll tell me I can't. And of course, Ade's point is you do it anyway, which is very powerful. Before we go, just
quickly from all three of you, because you've been so fascinating. Is there one thing in terms of representation within theatre of either gender or race that you think you'd really like to see? Is there one thing, one tip you would have for any theatre owners out there listening to you? You know, what would you say, this is the one thing that would make a difference to how we programme and how we write?
I suppose for me, what I've noticed in theatre, and I really like what's happening in theatre, but what for me, I just want to see more Black British stories of now. I'm seeing a lot of Black American stories, a lot of Black American narratives that are amazing. I'm also seeing, you know, great historical stuff. Some of it is familiar. On telly, we've got The Suitable Boy. It feels very distant from the British experience. And it's the British, you know, experience, Black British experience, but also women being able to write about, you know, playful stuff, historical stuff, anything, rather than just, again, it's that double bind of, yes, we need to and we want to write about the issues, the big issues, heritage, whatever, identity, whatever you want to call it, but also we should be allowed to write about the playful stuff, the science fiction, the fantasy, all across the genres, and I just want to see that. It's a variety, I suppose.
Ade.
I agree. That sums it up really beautifully. I actually was a theatre reviewer in the 80s and 90s, and yeah, it was all mainly African American work. Although we did have actually in that period, lots of homegrown Black British companies. One thing that I yearn for, and I was thinking about this as I was thinking about Andrea's work. Somebody, I think it was Arifa, mentioned how the Queenie character almost eclipsed Hortense in the adaptation of Small Island. I love the way Andrea explores white women, Black women, the relationships between July and Caroline, for example, in The Long Song is fascinating. But I actually think I yearn for stories about Black women engaging with each other. Am I just missing them? But there seems to be a bit of an absence. And the reason I noticed that is because the woman who was in Black Panther, the actress who wrote a play at the Young Vic, Arifa, you'll know who I mean, the Zimbabwean actress. She wrote a play about Zimbabwean history. The girl from Black Panther.
Letitia.
Yes.
Letitia Wright.
Oh my gosh, I love her. She was the star. The Convert, that's it.
Yeah.
And in that play, there was a scene which I reeled when I saw it. It was two Black women, having a debate about history. And I thought, I'm writing a play about Phyllis Wheatley, which is an enslaved woman.
Oh, are you?
But she was a poet. She's very unlike the July.
She features in my novel.
Of course, yes, and you've got some other characters from the era who you've reconfigured for your period, although they were in the 1780s.
Yes.
Barbara is in my play, and Ignatius.
I'm really excited to see that.
I have her meeting, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. I got it as a birthday present, so that's my next treat. But anyway, the point I'm making is, it made me, having seen Denai's play The Convert, I got now Phyllis Wheatley in relationship with lots of Black women, which I hadn't actually noticed as an omission, but I think that is an omission, and I'd like to see more of that inter-conversation, if you like, between us.
Sara.
That is so exciting, and I couldn't agree more with both Ade and Arifa. I think since I'm the sort of outsider to theatre, let me speak from an audience point of view. What I would like to see is a diversification of the audience, and I think that is happening. I do agree that democratization depends on things like making theatre available online, looking at ticket prices, looking at who's involved in productions and what stories are being told. I think that the key to having diverse stories produced is tapping into the demand. When diverse audiences flock to theatre, then diverse stories will be demanded. And so I really would like to see a kind of opening up and a widening of that sort of outreach. And I think it has started. I think things are changing from my outsider's perspective. But it's work that needs to continue.
Yeah, well, that is a wonderful note on which to finish. This should have been the press night for The Long Song at Chichester Festival Theatre. We would have had a wonderful time there tonight. I know the theatre is doing everything they can to make sure that as many of the wonderful things that would have happened in this season will happen next year, and we'll just all have to watch this space for that. But you've all been so open and so generous with your thoughts. And it's been an absolute privilege to listen to you, Arifa Akbar, Sara Collins and Solanke. And I really hope that if the Long Song is on next year, you will come and see it. And more than anything, I hope you will come and see my play as well, which should be on next year. And we will just cheer all the women that Chichester Festival Theatre are putting on stage and behind scenes as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
We will look forward to every piece of work that you've talked about. And for the audience at CFT, it's lovely that you joined us. We're really delighted to be able to bring some of the tiny nuggets that would have been happening in the season through these digital meetings as well. So whatever you're writing, whatever you're reading, whatever you're viewing, same thing. Every time you read a brilliant bit of work by a woman, see a brilliant bit of work by a woman, pass it on. Good night, everybody, and thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you.
Bye.